under the guidance of series coordinator and professor of English, Dr. Susan Jacobowitz, who many of you know as well, and with the help of Dr. Arthur Flug and Miss Marissa Berman of Queensborough's Kupferberg Holocaust Resource Center and Archives, I've organized 3 disabilities-focused events for my portion of this year's series. My first event revolved around the documentary film Liebe Perla, which explored the transnational friendship of 2 women with disabilities, Hannelore, a German researcher, and Perla, a Holocaust survivor. Dr. Simi Linton and Mr. Christian von Tippelskirch set up and provided comments on that documentary. In her comments during that first event, Dr. Linton encouraged attendees to think about the various ways in which definitions and images of disability have been used in the United States. Today's event, the second of my 3, picks up on this idea. In just moments, we will benefit from the insights of Dr. Sarah Chinn, who will deliver a talk titled Blood, Disability, and the Meanings of Japanese-American Citizenship in World War II. Dr. Chinn is an associate professor of English at Hunter College. She received her Ph.D. in English and Comparative Literature from Columbia University. Her work primarily explores questions of race, sexuality, and gender in U.S. literature and culture, particularly in the 19th century. She's the author of 2 books, Technology and the Logic of American Racism, A Cultural History of the Body as Evidence, and Inventing Modern Adolescence, The Children of Immigrants in Turn-of-the-Century America. She has also published numerous scholarly articles on 19th century U.S. literature, gender and sexuality, and disability studies. Dr. Chinn is currently working on 2 book-length manuscripts, one on representations of masculinity on the early American stage, and the other on amputation as a trope for national and personal loss in the Civil War. Please, if you will, hold your comments and questions until after the talk, and also please join me in welcoming Dr. Chinn here to Queensborough.
Thank you, and thanks so much for coming at I know it is a very busy time of year. So this is actually, it's interesting, I went back to my first book to kind of pull the material for this talk today, but then thought about how I would use the same material from a disability perspective. So it was really interesting for me to do this, so I'll be really glad to hear what you have to say. Okay, so I'm going to get started. In the United States, in the 1940s, something happened to blood. More than one thing, and on more than one level. What people could and would do with blood was changing, both literally and metaphorically. The literal changes are fairly easy to trace. The advances in blood transfusion technology, the development of reconstitutable dried plasma, new analyses of anemia, among other biotechnological work. The metaphorical cultural changes are a little more difficult to identify, and in my talk today, I'd like to examine a few of them. In particular, I'll be discussing the enlisting of blood and blood donation into an emerging discourse of American citizenship, and who that status newly included. American Jews, in the example I'll be looking at, and who it excluded. African Americans, who are actually a big part of the chapter from the book that I'm talking about here, but I'm not going to talk about today, and who I am going to be talking about in detail, Japanese Americans. Blood as a metaphor for racial identity works most powerfully when it cannot be seen, in a world in which blood cannot be scrutinized outside the body. The very invisibility of blood in the years after slavery, for example, made it a potent symbol. The one-drop rule argued that race was not what was on the outside, but rather was constituted in the most basic unit of human life, the blood itself. It summons up the image of an unassimilable blob of blackness, right, the one drop, that continually circulates through the bloodstream, something that can be identified as separate from the millions of other drops and that overpowers them rather than being diluted by them. This way of imagining race was profoundly undermined by the development of blood transfusion technology. Once blood could be stored outside the body, examined microscopically, typed by elements rather than by racial categories, and transferred not just from one body to another, but from body to test tube and bottle to body, the conflation of racial and blood purity could not be sustained. And the discovery of type O, the universal donor type, shredded white supremacist fantasies about the literal entity of white blood. This issue became pressing in the 1940s as blood took on another meaning, one directly related to the intense need for blood donation on the Pacific and European war fronts. Ironically, World War II could not have come at a better time as far as blood technology was concerned. An array of information about drawing, classifying, storing, and administering whole blood and plasma was settling into place by 1941 and was indispensable to the Allied war effort. In what follows, I want to trace a few of the routes that the discourse of blood took during this period. One is the concerted campaign by the American Red Cross to represent blood donation as the highest form of home front citizenship, a campaign that unfortunately was marred by the ARC's labeling and segregation of blood from black and white donors. And these two interrelated policies threw into sharp focus the ways in which a de-racialized discourse of blood could both undermine and underlie white supremacy. The second is the uneasy relationship between blood, citizenship, loyalty, and able-bodiedness that characterized the discourse around Japanese-American internment, and that's exemplified in John Okada's 1957 novel, No Boy, which I'm going to be talking about in some detail. While I have time only to outline my arguments, I hope to show that blood was a labile and powerful symbol during the war years, all, of course, in the shadow of the unambiguous language of blood purity that suffused Nazi Germany. I won't go into the details of the ARC's blood donor service, except to say that it was a major effort on the home front. By 1942, there were 35 fixed donation centers in major cities, from Buffalo to San Antonio, Boston to Los Angeles, and 63 mobile units to service neighboring towns. The need was large. By the end of 1943, the Army and Navy were projecting a need of 70,000 pints of blood per week. The first priority of the blood donor service, the BDS, was to flood the popular media with positive images of blood donation, from magazines to radio to movies to posters. Enterprising publicity writers crafted whole editorials and interviews, already pre-scripted, for newspapers and radio, provided tips for fashioning day-to-day stories about blood centers, and created sample newspaper releases and spontaneous op-ed pieces with blanks to be filled in for regional specificity. Movie studios inserted references to blood donation in both commercial and government-sponsored productions with a direct message: give blood or our boys die. The BDS publicity campaign was wildly successful, and media attention on blood donation centers was constant. Donations outstripped the need to almost 111,000 pints per week by January of 1944. And I'd argue that a large part of its success was its representation of blood donation as an outgrowth of diverse but single-minded American democracy, encapsulated in the phrase, from every walk of life. So donors from every walk of life, citizens from every walk of life, Americans from every walk of life, flood the donation centers. The patriotism of giving blood was represented in a variety of ways, always channeled through the ideal of democratic mutuality between donor and recipient and among donors. This mutuality of American identity extended to the Red Cross itself. A 1944 Red Cross movie trailer produced by the War Activities Committee featured a report from Humphrey Bogart at the front. Bogey, an appealing everyman himself, hammers home the importance of the blood donor service, calling plasma, quotes, that gift of blood to our men. More significantly, Bogart constructs a sense of reciprocity between the armed forces, the Red Cross, and the trailer's viewers, since, and this is Bogart, the Red Cross is at their side, and the Red Cross is you. This interrelation that the BDS constructed among civilian Americans, our boys in the military, and the Red Cross itself was a building block in a larger edifice, a discourse of American citizenship that was at once deeply democratic and profoundly discriminatory, as the Red Cross itself was in its segregation of racialized blood. The repeated claim that donors were from all walks of life and that servicemen were our boys constructed a sense of American citizenship that was both praiseworthy and exceptional, and at the same time unmarked and unexamined. It was not that Americans were a nation of superhumans. Rather, to be an American was to be most fully human, so that American ordinariness was another form of human excellence. A striking example of this is an episode of The Nation's Press Women Speak, which was an ongoing radio forum that in February 1943 dealt with the issue of blood donation. The participants were high-powered newspaper women from the Washington Post, the Associated Press, and the International News Service. The host, INS reporter Lee Carson, introduces this evening's topic as, quotes, "the kind of story that every reporter likes to write. It's a hero story, the story of real Americans. You cannot make this stuff up." Mary Spargo of the Washington Post takes up the theme of exceptionalism in American identity, and she says, "To me, the blood donor program is the greatest and most triumphant expression of the patriotism and will to victory of the American people," close quotes. The participants don't dwell on the nobility of blood donation, however. They shift to its democratic qualities. As Lee Carson explains, quote, "The privilege of donation isn't limited to any class or group of Americans. Brooklyn housewives, Hoosiers from Indiana, Hollywood glamour girls and Boston fishermen, busboys and big shots, debutantes and dowagers, rich and poor, all are marching to blood donor centers." Blood donation, in this case, is for everyone and represents not simply a gift, but participation in the fight for democracy. When Jane Eads, another of the speakers of the Associated Press, asserts, quotes, "all of us in good health can well afford a pint of blood," Lee Carson responds, "that sort of makes it a democratic contribution." Carson's assertion effortlessly connects able-bodiedness, democratic subjectivity, and American exceptionalism. The final piece of this puzzle is the one that is never explicitly spoken, but that undergirded both the ARC's blood donation efforts and the consolidation of ideas about American identity in the 20th century: whiteness. As many scholars have shown, the absorption of non-Anglo whites into the imagined community of American whiteness took place during this same period, most notably Jews and Italians, who as late as the 1930s were imagined as racially other from the Nordics, that is legitimately white, as they became white folks, as the Irish had before them. The Brooklyn housewives Carson invokes were those ethnic others. And Brooklyn here, always in the 1940s, means Jews and Italians, always. Who through blood donation and other civic works could be counted as making, quotes, "a democratic contribution." In this new vision of the American polity, whiteness and able-bodiedness, coded here as health, were the prerequisites for the hero story, the story of real Americans. Moreover, just as blood donation was also a miracle of modern science, the democratic, civically responsible American was also a product of modernity, whose actions remade America again and again. A text that interrogates these intersections of blood, citizenship, and able-bodiedness, and modernity, and American identity is an amazing novel called Wasteland that was published in 1946, a little red novel by Joe Sinclair, which was a pseudonym for Jewish-American novelist Ruth Side. Wasteland is a fascinating and moving text that confronts the alienation of photojournalist John Brown, née Jake Brownowitz, and his eventual recovery through the help of a psychiatrist, sessions with whom make up the frame of the novel. So Jake hates himself and his family, particularly because they're Jews. He understands himself through racialized metaphors of blood and genealogy, both of which he attempts to escape through alcoholism, the separation of home and work lives, affairs with non-Jewish women, and emotional distancing from his family. However, and this is in his mind, quotes, "nothing had not done any good. Changing his name had not done it. Drinking had not, nor the things he did evenings." He cannot flee his blood. The novel's challenge is how to integrate the genealogical blood identity of Judaism to the fraternal identity of American citizenship. Wasteland follows Jake's emotional recovery, a process that's facilitated by his younger sister, Debbie. She's a writer for the WPA, and Ruth Side was a leftist organizer, so the fact that Debbie's with the WPA is kind of, meaningful. She's firmly opposed to their brother, second brother, Sig's casual racism. She's a lesbian and a heroic figure in the novel. Debbie is secure enough in her American identity to speak Yiddish with her parents, but is not marked physically by Jewishness. She looks to Jake like a Gentile boy. At his first job, Jake gives an anglicized name, John Brown, a name that was, quotes, beautiful. It was as American-looking, as anonymous as any name he could think of. For Sinclair, the choice of this anonymous American name is a way for Jake to radically separate the, quotes, something inside his blood from the professional identity he constructs for himself, and both cause and effect of his alienation from himself and everything around him. The text insists on Jake's genealogy by using the name his family gave him, Jake, rather than the name he chooses for himself, John, or the diminutive that his sister Debbie and his co-workers use, Jack. Jake's self-hatred bursts into his consciousness at a family Seder when he's 15. Previously, the Seder had been a high point of the year for him, an event full of spiritual and emotional connection. Particularly important to him was the recitation of the Manishtana, the 4 questions, which he as the youngest son would chant, and then this is his stream of consciousness. Oh, beautiful, Jake thought, oh, mysterious of God and of life that is handed down through the thousands of years. And my voice has to come now, the way it's written that the youngest son has to talk at this second. Me, Jake, I have a place in this story, close quotes. The shift from reverence and connection to scorn and disgust occurs when Jake completes the 4 questions and looks around at the rest of his family. Quotes, it struck him with an appalling clarity that they had not been listening. The prayers were being uttered mechanically, a sing-song reading of one word after another, one automatic phrase after another, close quotes. And at that moment, Jake's family life is revealed to him to be, this is him, a damn lie. And he thinks about his father, right? Was that the way it was to be a Jew, to be like his father in everyday life, then to sit at the Seder table like the patriarch of old, dignified, praying? It was a lie, close quotes. Jake positions his father's stinginess and emotional emptiness in brutal contrast to the richness of Jewish tradition. The knowledge that, quotes, his father was a dirty stranger and his mother a frightened, sad, incapable woman, that his older brother was a stranger with bored, cold eyes, and that his sister, not Debbie, another sister, was overly rouged and her flesh restless for he knew what, close quotes, drives him to a knee-jerk anti-Semitism, the belief that, quotes, if his father was a Jew, then by God, all Jews were like his father, and he, Jake, would not be a Jew, close quotes. Set in diametrical opposition to Jewishness is Americanness, whereas being Jewish is, quote, dirty and rotten, stingy, illiterate, as his father is. Being American is, quote, strength and cleanliness, a transparent identity that does not have to explain itself. For Jake, Americanness is an alchemical compound of untrammeled identity and complete anonymity, being most yourself and being at the same time most like everyone else. He feels excluded from American identity by the conspicuous Jewishness of his name and by association of his parents. His life feels contingent, unsettled, because he cannot commit to his genealogy, Jewishness, nor feel admitted to an effortless, quasi-Christian American identity. Quotes, nothing was regular with him, habit or custom or breakfast at home or even Christmas, wonderful things celebrated by all the others at the office. He always received gifts, sure, but he knew all the time it wasn't his holiday. See, there again, he was different from everybody else. And I hope that you also hear in this strength and cleanliness, right, this white American able-bodiedness. Jake can only fully realize his fantasy of belonging when he can reconcile his sense of ethnic otherness with the anonymous, neutral, transparent Americanism to which he aspires. This integration also puts him on the road to psychological able-bodiedness. While he's physically able, his ambivalence and conflict create emotional damage, which for the novel is as debilitating as physical impairment. The transition from neurosis to mental health, from self-hatred to self-esteem, from anti-Semitism to empathy for his family, culminates in 2 acts of volunteering. First, to donate blood, and second, to enlist in the army. It's his sister Debbie, our WPA lesbian hero, who suggests that Jake accompany her to the Red Cross Donor Center. Like newspaper journalists all over the country in the mid-40s, Jake has been to the donor center in a professional capacity, quotes, to take pictures of people giving blood. It made swell art, close quotes, but he has not participated himself. For Jake, giving blood constructs him as the ordinary American he has fantasized being, unique and anonymous, both indivisible and singular. As he says to his psychiatrist, quotes, you give your blood, you couldn't give anything better. Why say they couldn't take anything from you that you give them on your own, that's more valuable, that's more you, close quotes. For Jake, giving blood is a way to be, quotes, like any guy in America. Debbie has given blood 3 times before, but she's not forgotten, quotes, how I felt the first time, awfully jittery, to give a pint of your blood, well, to the world. I felt at one with everybody, just everybody. For Debbie, giving blood is a reciprocal process, from her to the world and from everybody back to her. Debbie is particularly inspired by the fact that, quotes, 10,000 people are doing the same thing everywhere in America, close quotes, creating a community of mutual cooperation in a national project. And she sees her donation gaining her admission into a modern kind of democratic citizenship, a populism that can embrace Americans from all walks of life. So we're seeing this language again and again and again, right? In the blood donation, in movies, in this novel. So she says, I feel as if I'm giving it for the Jews too, Jews like Ma who never had a break, and I'm giving a pint for the Negroes. It's like giving your blood against any kind of segregation there is in the world, anybody who is slapped in the face, laughed at, pushed into a corner of society. They can have my blood, close quotes. Jake's feelings about giving blood are filtered through his psychiatrist's notes, the vehicle Sinclair uses to summarize and synthesize the changes Jake experiences throughout the novel. So this really weird image where he sees his blood dissolved into a vat of Americanness, quotes, and this is the psychiatrist speaking. In offering his blood, Jake feels strengthened. Jewish blood, in his mind, not long ago a despised thing, has been accepted and now flows into the mixture of American blood. Jake has given his blood. He gave as a Jew and as a patriot to some degree, but most important, he gave as every man, close quotes. Jake's difference is erased by his acceptance by the Red Cross, which his psychiatrist, as the ARC itself did, identifies with, quotes, the world, America at war. Sitting in the blood center, he has, quotes, a strange feeling. His blood would merge anonymously with the cities, the countries, and then with the world, close quotes. He is also given, quotes, as Jake Brown, the name he writes on his donor card. These two names, Jewish and American, have merged to construct a new identity for him. And after the bleeding is over, he asks Debbie to call him Jake rather than Jack, a sign that his Jewishness has been robbed of its psychic power over him, and he can now be emotionally as well as politically and culturally whole. Now, Jews are simply one of the many walks of life from which blood donors come. Far from being alien, they have in Jake's imagination been domesticated, made able-bodied, subsumed under the larger, indivisible label of America. But the assimilability of his Jewish blood is an assimilability that Debbie refuses. Despite her feeling of oneness, she sees this immersion in an undifferentiated Americanism as, in fact, and as it was, undergirding a system of segregation that she deplores. Right, so she says, I'm giving my blood against every kind of segregation they can be. The same act that bestows modern citizenship upon white donors enters their blood into, quotes, the mixture of American blood, close quotes, is transformed in meaning by racialization. And Debbie reveals that, quotes, where we're going now, the blood center, they keep Negro and white blood separate, and this was a policy of the American Red Cross to racially segregate white and black blood. Isn't it amazing, she says, they make little ghettos for a thing like blood. When I give my pint, Jack, it's against that too. Someday they'll know they can't do a thing like that. Part of my blood will show them someday, close quotes. Debbie imagines her blood affecting a kind of cultural transformation in the veins of the people who receive it. Her blood will show the nameless, faceless people whose lives it will save that segregation is wrong by successfully integrating into them. Her difference, like the one drop, will maintain its integrity even as it combines with the blood of any number of others. So Wasteland works through the thematics of blood donation that the publicist at the Red Cross Blood Donor Service devoted 4 years to establishing. Blood as a sign of active and unambiguous American citizenship, blood donation as an act of community with both the rest of the American public and the armed forces, the Red Cross itself as a conduit for the union of donor and recipient. But as much as the novelist Jo Sinclair wants to represent blood donation and its, to Jake, inevitable corollary, volunteering for active duty, right? So first you volunteer your blood and then you volunteer your whole body into active duty in the armed services. And as a heroic act of American ordinariness that can change the life of the donor as much as, or here psychologically more than, the life of the recipient. Debbie's deep ambivalence about the racial politics of blood banking disrupts this utopian idea. Debbie may have been instrumental to Jake's blood donation, but she also complicates its meaning. Just as Sinclair introduces the symbolics of giving blood, only to unsettle the economy of citizenship she herself proposes. Indeed, the Red Cross's segregation of blood into white and colored both disturbs and affirms the new language of blood as citizenship, as American identity. Okay, so in the final section of my talk today, I want to complicate these terms of citizenship and able-bodiedness and their channeling through whiteness. While discourses of blood and citizenship were crucial to changes in European and African American identities in the 1940s, and to the restating of and resistance to Jim Crow during the war years, no discussion of the relationship between race, blood, and citizenship during this period can go without an analysis of the evacuation and internment of Japanese Americans on the West Coast between 1942 and 1945. And now I'm just going to give a brief history of that, very brief. Okay, so the US government, through the agency of the Western Command under General John DeWitt, ordered 110,000 American citizens of Japanese descent from their homes in California, Western Washington, and Oregon, and northern Arizona, imprisoned them in assembly centers, and then remanded them to, quotes, relocation centers, which was a euphemism for concentration camps, often in barren, windswept areas in the Western desert. As historians of Japanese settlement in the US have shown, the story of internment is in many ways simply an intensification of the anti-Japanese racism that plagued Japanese American communities throughout the West Coast. And we see this in the history of every genocide, right? It's not like people suddenly went, hey, we hate these people, let's kill them all, right? That the genocide is always a culmination of a much larger and longer lasting set of discrimination and prejudice and subordination of that group. And we see this here with the internment of Japanese Americans. It's not like everyone loved Japanese Americans and then suddenly they said, let's round them up. There was a distrust of and discrimination against Japanese Americans that made this possible, made it imaginable. Okay, so this starts in fact, 1790, when the first act of Congress is to restrict naturalization to white people. So only white people can become citizens of the United States if they're originally from somewhere else, which shut out the Japanese who came to the US 100 years later as immigrants. And then in 1913, the Alien Land Act prevented aliens not eligible for citizenship from owning land, effectively excluding Japanese immigrants. Then in 1922, the Supreme Court formally affirmed the congressional restriction on naturalization in Ozawa versus the USA, and by 1924, Congress had passed the Japanese Exclusion Act, which severely limited Japanese immigration. Given the restrictions on American citizenship for Issei, which are first-generation Japanese, second-generation Japanese, Nisei, were in a peculiar position. Born in the United States, they immediately acquired the rights of US citizenship. At the same time, the Japanese rule of jus sanguinis, which means the right of the blood, accorded them Japanese nationality as well. White observers of Nisei culture often remarked on their, quotes, pathetic eagerness to be Americans, close quotes, while the self-appointed Nisei leadership rejected the language of blood, which gave them Japanese nationality, and embraced American citizenship that was denied their parents. The first Japanese-American organization, the Loyalty League, was formed in 1919 and decided not to use the word Japanese in its name so as to downplay its origins. It was not until the 1930s that a variety of West Coast Nisei groups coalesced into the Japanese-American Citizens League, the first Nisei organization to include the word Japanese in its name. As the names of these groups demonstrate, second-generation Japanese Americans were well aware of the stakes of citizenship, not least because their parents were so limited by the prohibition on their naturalization. The bombing of Pearl Harbor, of course, exacerbated this tension between Issei exclusion from citizenship and Nisei embracing of it. On December 7th and 8th, Roosevelt issued Executive Orders 2525 and 2526, restraining German, Italian, or Japanese nationals from communicating with or aiding the enemy, and confiscated firearms and cameras, restricted travel, and limited membership in nationalist organizations. However, attention soon shifted away from German and Italian aliens and onto the Japanese alone. On February 19, 1942, the President promulgated Executive Order 9066, which gave the Secretary of War the power to declare any regions of the country military areas. And this is a quotation from the order, from which any or all persons may be excluded, and with respect to which the right of any person to enter, remain in, or leave shall be subject to whatever restrictions the Secretary of War or the appropriate military commander may impose in his discretion, close quotes. Then the next day, Secretary of War Henry Stimson handed over control of the Western Defense Command, which encompassed the Pacific Coast, to Lieutenant General John L. DeWitt, and within 2 weeks, DeWitt had proclaimed the entire West Coast, all of California, Western Washington, Western Oregon, Northern Arizona, to be a military area. He then imposed a curfew on Italian and German nationals and all West Coast residents of Japanese descent, about of whom 2/3 were Nisei, so they're actually American citizens, and between March and November of the same year began issuing proclamations to, quote, evacuate all Japanese Americans from Western military areas to assembly centers and finally to relocation centers further into the country's interior. DeWitt is a fascinating, though odious, character. In the official documents in which we hear his voice, his contempt and disgust for people of Japanese descent are broadcast clearly. At stake in the evacuation was, according to DeWitt, the impossibility of determining Japanese, quotes, loyalty. And I think we can see this very similarly with the language around Muslim Americans today. And I just want you to listen for these echoes. Quotes, and this is DeWitt, American citizenship does not necessarily determine loyalty. In his pronunciamentos, DeWitt tangles up race, citizenship, nationality, loyalty, and identity, contradicting himself but always returning to the same conclusion. The Japanese cannot be trusted. On the one hand, he's forced to admit that the majority of Japanese evacuees were, quotes, this is him, American-born, had been through American schools, had not developed Oriental thought patterns, whatever those are, or had been subjected to so-called Japanese culture, close quotes. On the other hand, DeWitt needed to believe in the total unassimilation of even US-born Japanese Americans, that they could not function as real American citizens. In this same report, he claimed that, quotes, the Japanese race is an enemy race, and while many second and third generation Japanese born of United States soil, possessed of United States citizenship, have become, quotes, Americanized, the racial strains are undiluted, close quotes. So in DeWitt's telling, Japaneseness is a kind of disability, a congenital disorder that can never be healed. For DeWitt, there is something that the Japanese, however Americanized they might be, whether citizens or not, cannot achieve, and that lack makes them a threat. The name he gives to this quality is loyalty. By shifting the argument for internment away from citizenship, which would otherwise raise the issue of habeas corpus and constitutional rights, to loyalty, DeWitt creates a kind of conditional citizenship, one that cannot speak for itself. Nisei are, in his words, citizens of Japanese blood, which is itself a working contradiction given the technologies of citizenship functioning in the 1940s, whose status as citizens is compromised and hence must be undergirded by more than just the fact of having a US passport. So the disability of Japaneseness trumps the health and able-bodiedness of American citizenship. The argument for Nisei removal and internment depended upon the assumption that their embodiment as citizens had less integrity than that of other Americans. By dint of being Japanese, they were condemned to an economy of genealogy, closed off from the identity of citizenship. The transformation of blood from a sign of genealogy, vertically inheritable within a closed group of parents and children, into a sign of citizenship, horizontally transferable through modern scientific advances from any one citizen or another, in other words, parentage versus blood donation, could not be extended to Japanese Americans. Under the terms of removal and internment, Nisei were no longer citizens, but instead the term was used non-aliens. They were both separable from the citizenry as a group and unrecognizable as individuals within that group. The opposite of the ideal, that is, of the typical American citizen. The JACL, the Japanese American Citizenship League, believed that the best response to DeWitt's argument that racial strains incapacitated loyalty was simply more affirmations of how loyal Japanese Americans were. They requested tests that could measure loyalty, the separation of the loyal from the disloyal, the admission of the loyal into the armed services. And needless to say, this was a losing argument, because once you racialize loyalty, it's all over. Japanese Americans' opportunity to prove their loyalty came in 1943, when the Selective Service Administration opened up the draft for Nisei. Part of the lengthy form that were two questions that asked whether they were willing to serve in the armed forces and whether they would, and this is a quote from the form, forswear any form of allegiance or obedience to the Japanese emperor, close quotes. And this question is troubling from the beginning because it presupposes such allegiance and obedience and denies Japanese American loyalty to the United States from the outset. Ichiro Yamada, the protagonist of John Okada's novel No No Boy, answered no to both questions. No, I will not serve, and no, I will not forswear loyalty, because he says, I don't have that loyalty in the first place to forswear it. And this decision sent him to the federal penitentiary for 2 years. Much like Jake Brown/Brownowitz, he feels torn between his Japanese genealogy and his American political identity. And the novel begins when he returns home to Seattle after 2 years in prison, just after the war. He finds his father an alcoholic, his mother maintaining the delusion that Japan has won the war and waiting for a ship to take them back to Japan, and his brother Taro, who is so ashamed of him that he's about to join the army to sort of cancel out Ichiro's refusal. Ichiro feels exiled from his American self, but unable to regain any sense of being Japanese. Ichiro's lover, Emi, recognizes the compromised citizenship of Japanese Americans in her analysis of how their lives began to disintegrate, and this is Emi. It's because we're American and because we're Japanese, and sometimes the two can't mix. It's all right to be German and American, or Italian and American, or Russian and American, but as things turned out, it wasn't all right to be Japanese and American, close quotes. Ichiro's complement is Kenji, his contemporary, whose leg was destroyed in the war and who's the most heroic character in the novel. Kenji's wound has turned gangrenous despite multiple amputations, and over the course of the novel we see him dying, and he dies towards the end. Kenji and Ichiro's relationship is a sort of this weird chiasmus, right? Sort of this cross between the two of them. So one, Ichiro, already dead, but still alive and contemplating 50 or 60 more years of dead aliveness, and the other, Kenji, living and dying slowly. Kenji is, quotes, more American than most Americans because he had crept to the brink of death for America, close quotes. And his family is Americanized, eating roast chicken and lemon meringue pie and watching baseball. Kenji fantasizes about the possibility of running away from being Japanese, and towards the end of the novel he exhorts Ichiro to, quotes, go someplace where there isn't another Jap within 1,000 miles, marry a white girl or a Negro or an Italian or even a Chinese, anything but Japanese. After a few generations of that, you've got the thing beat, close quotes. Rather than feeling embraced and absorbed by America, as Jake Brownowitz imagines happening after he donates blood, or as he believes will happen after he enlists in the army, Kenji envisions an ideal America that will swallow him whole into an open space that is empty of Japanese. The only way to fully participate in America is to dissolve the, quotes, racial strain with white or black or Chinese, quotes, blood. For all his baseball watching and pie eating, Kenji cannot imagine an American citizenship that is compatible with a Japanese genealogy. Kenji is Ichiro's mirror and his opposite. He is a war hero with a silver star. In Ichiro's mind, quotes, Kenji was a veteran of the Army of America and had every right to laugh and hope and love because because one could do that even if one of his legs was gone. While for white Americans, good health enables blood donation and therefore the imprimatur of citizenship, Kenji's disability makes his Americanness possible. And it's sort of like two negative numbers make a positive number, right? So to be Japanese American is to be disabled. To be Kenji is disabled. You put those two disabilities together and they cancel each other out and make Americanness possible. It's kind of this weird logic. At the same time, the internal contradiction of Japanese and American is literally destroying him via, quotes, a leg that was eating itself away until it would consume the man himself in a matter of a few years, close quotes. For Ichiro, Kenji's claim to American citizenship is preferable to his own shameful status. Quotes, this is Ichiro, I'll change with you, Kenji, he thought. Give me the stump which gives you the right to hold your head high. Kenji talks about his future in terms of inches of leg he has left. With each surgery, he loses inches. As the infection spreads, he loses more. And yet, according to the logic of the text, as his disability intensifies, he becomes more intrinsic to Ichiro's healing, to the narrative itself, and to this idea of American identity. For a significant chunk of the novel, we follow him more than Ichiro, and he engages in a long meditation on race and democracy, more sophisticated than Ichiro's tortured monologues. This is Kenji's thought. Was there no answer to the bigotry and meanness and smallness and ugliness of people? One hears the voice of the Negro or Japanese or Chinese or Jew, a clear and bell-like intonation of the common struggle for recognition as a complete human being. And there is a sense of unity and purpose which inspires one to hope and optimism, close quotes. Kenji's bodily disintegration makes possible his reconstitution as the ideal American citizen, dreaming of a heaven in which, and this is Kenji, quotes, there aren't any Japs or Chinks or Jews or Poles or niggers or Frenchies, but only people, close quotes. No Boy narrates the ugly underside of the rhetoric of healthy American citizenship. It is bounded tightly by whiteness and by an identity defined by blood for all of its claims to the contrary. Only at the moment of his own disembodiment can Kenji look but beyond the strictures of American exceptionalism, uniting not just Americans of different races, but creating a sort of United Nations of the afterlife. By the end of the novel, Ichiro is alone, trying to find a place for himself. Quotes, he walked along, thinking, searching, thinking and probing, and in the darkness of the alley of the community that was a tiny bit of America, he chased that faint and elusive insinuation of a promise as it continued to take shape in mind and in heart, close quotes. Ichiro's new birth into Americanness is hesitant, partial, faint and elusive, quite different from Jake's triumphant entrance into the pulsing bloodstream of America. As Iris Marion Young has ruefully argued, quotes, many among the excluded and disadvantaged have thought that winning full citizenship status, that is, equal political and civil rights, would lead to their freedom and equality, close quotes. At a moment in which Americans were thinking explicitly about citizenship as a mutuality of bodies, and blood was a symbol of the interconnectedness of all citizens, structures were also forming that would fashion barriers around that mutuality. Japanese American citizenship could not exist on the same terms as the citizenship of white ethnic enemy aliens like Germans or Italians. They could not constitute a, quotes, healthy person or represent one of the walks of life. In the final moments of No Boy, Ichiro is walking, chasing an insinuation of a promise, so faint it is almost invisible. This promise, we might imagine, is the one that we started with, the promise of a modern kind of democratic citizenship. However, those words take on different meaning when they are more than a sales pitch for blood donations. For Ichiro and for thousands of Nisei like him, that promise was faint and elusive indeed. Thanks. So I hope that wasn't too abstract.
No, lots to think about. Thank you so much. Yeah, absolutely. I'd like to ask all of you for any questions that you might have. I have quite a number of them, but I'd like to direct our attention to you.
Yeah, hi.
I'm a historian, so it's a very different approach to, and it's really fascinating. And one of the things that you mentioned about this identity of whiteness with health, right?
Yeah.
Clean blood with white blood.
Right.
Is there the equivalent of that in terms of aesthetics, meaning that you can debunk the notion that people have different blood? Well, we do have
Right.
that, it's not based on race, right? And science can basically debunk these notions that Negro blood or Jewish blood
Right.
is lesser than that. In these two characters, the Jewish fellow and the Nisei, is there a sense of what is aesthetically acceptable or not?
Not much, interestingly. I just reread No No Boy last night, so I was like, oh, that's such a great novel, highly recommended. There's a moment where Emmy, when Ichiro first meets Emmy, and he says she had long, shapely legs like a white woman, right? So this idea that like Asian women have short legs and white women have long legs. But beyond that, no, almost all the novel is set in the Japanese American community. So it's not, I mean, definitely there were kind of racist stereotypes of Jews and Japanese that were circulating, you know, certainly for Jews from the 19th century through to the 30s, and for Japanese Americans, it was like front and center during the war, right? So like the kind of thick lens glasses, the crazy teeth, you know, these kind of bloodshot eyes. You know, interestingly, not so much. Not like you see with the representation of African Americans, for example. And within the novels, no, not really.
I think Jake's sister is not as identifiably Jewish.
No, she looks like a Gentile boy. Yeah, absolutely. Which is so.
He felt marked by his Jewishness in a different way than.
Yes, yeah, but there's not sort of an aesthetic argument like you'll see in sort of 1920s writing about Jews, where it's so much about the swarthy Jew, or, you know, no, it's much, because in the 19th, so that part of what I'm arguing here is that particularly Jews and Italians who are marked as totally racially other in the 1920s get integrated into whiteness in the 40s through the vehicle of the war. And, you know, scholars have talked about this. You can see war movies, right, where you have your ragtag group, right? So you've got your farm boy from Iowa, you've got your Southern gentleman, you've got your Brooklyn Italian, you've got your New York Jew, and they all together make a unit, although of course, you know, the others get killed off really quickly. And even a more recent movie like Saving Private Ryan had it was like a 1940s, like, oh, here's our Jew, there he is, here's our Italian kid, here's our Southerner, right? And this was really an effort to talk about national unity. And in the years after the Civil War, you see that happening through North and South, right? During World War II, you see that through Anglo-Americans and white ethnics. And so you do see kind of physical differences. So the dark, curly-haired Italian, right? Or the skinny, nerdy Jewish kid, as opposed to the white, blonde Ohioan, right? But it's not racialized in the same way.
You see these notions of purity of blood or
Right.
racial superiority is accompanied with certain notions of aesthetics. It's
Right.
almost inseparable.
Yeah, I mean, I think what I found, at least in my research here, was that there's just this debate, right? So for example, there are all of these newspaper editorials in the 1940s saying, why is the Red Cross racially segregating blood? Everyone knows that blood doesn't have racial identity. Everyone knows that blood types happen across race. Everyone knows this, right? And then the Red Cross says, well, it's gonna make white people unhappy. Like, white soldiers are not gonna like this. And then the black press comes in and has this series of cartoons that show white soldiers lying in the field saying, I don't care what blood you give me, I just need to live, right? So then representing the Red Cross, which is all about patriotism and citizenship, as unpatriotic, right? So this debate is totally ongoing. It's not, The terms have not yet been settled. And so there's this moment, and what I'm trying to show is this moment where the meaning of blood is up for grabs and is shifting. And the idea of blood as race is starting to fall away, right? It's becoming sort of less dominant. And the idea of blood as something that can move between people is becoming more dominant. But there are all of these ideas about race and whiteness and blah, 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 that are still circulating, and that there are groups that still can't be assimilated, and Japanese Americans are one of them, right? It's interesting because African Americans make an argument about we're Americans too, right? They really make that argument because they can say we are as American as everyone else. Japanese Americans have a much harder time of that because of the Alien Land Act, because of the, that Japanese immigrants are not allowed to be naturalized. So they just have a much harder time. Yeah.
I'm wondering also, I mean, Japan frames its citizenship in blood.
Through blood, absolutely.
Right, so I'm also wondering what impact that sort of discourse, be it, happening in another region of the world, has on...
Well, I think the argument is, look, even Japan believes that they are, and of course, during World War II, you see, for example, the attack on Nanjing, those kind of arguments of racial blood superiority make the genocide in Nanjing possible, right? Make ongoing current discrimination against Korean Japanese. That's right. So it's not like that, and the sort of neo-nationalism that's happening in Japan now is absolutely understood through the language of blood. So blood never goes away, right? But it now, in the 1940s, it's like this way of looking at blood, this way of looking at blood, and they're kind of up against each other. And what I want to do is sort of see who can join in to giving blood as an act of citizenship. My blood is going to join this huge vat of blood, and who can't. And that's sort of what I'm interested in. Yeah.
Was that the only segregation of the blood?
Yeah.
So they didn't segregate Jewish blood? Or
No, not at all. No.
Mexicans in the Southwest?
Not as far as I know. Because because there was blood collection in San Antonio as well. That was where one of the permanent centers was. As far as I know, no.
How old did you have to be to give blood? Do you know?
I assume you have to be over 18. You have to be an adult.
I was wondering about 18 or 21, or how desperate they were for all.
They were
the blood.
desperate.
I
They
mean,
were
you're
desperate.
talking about a huge amount of blood.
Yeah.
Speaks a little bit to the exclusion of gay blood after the AIDS.
Oh, absolutely.
Blood pool based on something about their identity.
Right. Well, and actually, I'll tell you a little story, which is I'm not allowed to give blood because I grew up in England. And so even though I was vegetarian for most of my life, mad cow disease, the fear of mad cow disease, even though I was like, I don't have mad cow disease, right? But so the American Red Cross has this history of these weird, and they test all the blood anyway for everything. So, yeah, it is, but certainly,
Blood doesn't get mixed, like all the O blood doesn't go into a vat and then you get a pint of O blood. It's always just the pint that came from the person. Blood is...
No, it goes into a vat. Of course it goes into a vat. Yeah, of course. No, and in fact, much of the blood, and this I didn't have time to, this is from a much longer chapter, even though I talked for a long time. One technological advance that you get in the 40s is the ability to separate out plasma centrifugally and then dry plasma and then reconstitute it with water on the field. That changes everything. Because before that, you have to refrigerate blood, right? You can't just let it hang out, it coagulates. So it used to be that even though they had blood transfusion technology, it didn't do people any good in the field because they had no refrigeration. As soon as you can dry plasma, right, you now have all these envelopes of dried plasma that you just add water to. You mix it up and boom, you got a field transfusion. So this is, and you need a lot more blood to get plasma out of it, right? Because when you dry something, the solids are a lot less than all the liquid that's surrounded by it. Yeah, sure.
One of the things I find so interesting is this idea of sort of a multiracial national blood, right? A national kind of pooling of blood, right? But then at the same time, of course, there's so much discomfort with multiracial pairings, right? So you have, Loving versus Virginia and all this kind of stuff. So the idea that citizenship, we have this great vat of blood and it's multiracial in nature, and that's the democratic element, right?
But no black people.
But, yeah,
Yes, right.
but no black people.
Right.
And that's the big but.
Yeah.
I mean, this is, it's, and in fact, the Red Cross said, well, we don't want to upset the sensibilities of our Southern soldiers. That was the argument they gave. And this is, this sort of, I was looking for, appeasement of the racist South. So no, what I'm trying to show here is it's a limited fantasy, right? It brings some people who had previously not been considered white into the fold of whiteness, so what we now call white ethnics, and it explicitly excludes others, African Americans, Japanese Americans particularly. Yeah?
Oh, I was going to say, with that whole white and black blood separating, do you think it was really just a sort of a PR act, I guess, because when you're transporting that kind of blood around, it's going to get mixed up eventually.
Well, no, here's a good question. This is what they did. And I went into the Red Cross archives at the National Archives and looked at how did they do it, right? So you give blood and then it goes into a tube or a bottle or a bag and they would label it white or Negro.
So,
and then when it was transferred in the field, they would put all of the white blood together to be dried to plasma and all of the black. I mean, was there...
They were really that stubborn?
Yeah. I mean, were they, when it came down to it, did some of it get mixed up? Did some of it get mislabeled? But they said that it was labeled at every step of the process. So no, they did. I mean, it's a huge amount of work if you think about it, right? But no, they said that they did it. Even though, and well, first they denied that they did it. Like there's a whole kind of paper trail about memos back and forth. Did they do it? Did they not do it? Then they said, yes, we did do it. We do it. And then they say, well, we're just doing it because white people want it, right? So, and they know, the American Red Cross knows that it's bullshit. They know, right? They know this is not how blood works. But it's really, so there's this moment where these two historically specific ideas about blood are banging up against each other. And then what's interesting to me is the decision that's made, like which direction are you going to go in? Because they could have just as easily said, this is crap. Everyone knows it's crap. Blood is blood. The most important thing here is blood type. We've known that for about 90 years. They could have made that response, right? The same way with Korematsu versus United States, I guess, which is the case that the Supreme Court decided that said, yes, internment of Japanese is fine, right? The Supreme Court starts off by saying, there are some classifications like race that we need to pay extra attention to them. And we need to make sure that discrimination according to race doesn't happen, except in cases of what's called compelling state interest, right? So where the need of the country outweighs the civil rights of these people. And you think where they're going to go is, and so we really shouldn't intern the Japanese because there really is no compelling state interest. We know they're not spies. But instead the Supreme Court says, and so in fact, we have compelling state interest to violate these people's human rights, take them away from their homes, and put them in concentration camps. Right? And they could so easily have gone the other way. And that's sort of what I see here as well. Like the Red Cross could have made a very different decision. But because this is a language with which blood was talked about in some ways that have not yet fallen away, this is what we get.
When did they stop segregating the blood?
Like towards the end of the war, essentially, and then into the 50s, and I think, once you get the exposure of what happened in Nazi Germany, the language of blood just becomes very, very unsavory and very unattractive, in a way that it had been tolerated or, anywhere from tolerated to embraced before that. Yeah.
Just to weird people out even a little bit more, I'll throw in breast milk.
Okay.
I was reviewing documents last year that related to the trial of Adolf Eichmann, and there was a request to have a woman deported who had donated breast milk. They had a breast milk bank in Germany for people who were breastfeeding.
Right.
Needed supplement, and it turned out that she had a Jewish ancestor. So they wanted Eichmann to make sure that this woman was deported, this woman was killed, but they wanted to keep it very, very quiet because they didn't want women to become hysterical who had used the
That they drunk Jewish breast milk. Their babies had drunk Jewish breast milk.
A drop of Jewish breast milk. Yeah,
Wow.
breast milk bank. So this thing with fluids and with the body is like,
Because they are really fluid, right? They're really, and this is the thing,
really serious to people.
Yeah, and I think as well there is, really what I'm so interested in in this book that I wrote, but also sort of more generally, is how we see the relationship between inside and outside, right? And how when you can go inside the body, right, you can take blood out, you can open people up for surgery, that the body is no longer a mystery. The insides of the body are no longer a mystery, right? How does that interact with the ideas that we have about what people's bodies mean? You know, and one thing that we see, and this is actually an insight from a really terrific sociologist of science called Bruno Latour. Bruno Latour says, look, you know, the scientific world doesn't necessarily, scientific advances do not necessarily change our minds, right? We have to be, the culture has to want to change the way it sees people in order for scientific advances to actually change the culture. And here's this moment where all these scientific advances have happened. People know that blood has nothing to do with race. They know it, right? Hematologists know it, doctors know it, but the culture isn't ready for that yet. The culture hasn't caught up. And the Red Cross, because they are both a scientific organization, but also a cultural organization, right? And an organization that's pushing this very specific kind of patriotic citizenship, is negotiating between those two sets of ideas, right? Between what science knows and what people believe. And it's not just an easy, you know, like, well, now we know that blood is blood, everyone's going to change their mind suddenly. It just doesn't happen that way. And that's what I'm sort of trying to figure out here.
I think similar questions are bubbling up around DNA right now.
Oh, I have the last chapter of my book is about DNA, actually.
Yeah.
You know.
And gay marriage, you know,
Yeah.
the culture change, something naturally occurring, but the culture has to change or society
Right.
has to change.
Well, and also I think that the answers we find depend upon and are shaped by the questions we want to ask, right?
Well, the interesting thing with DNA is that in the last, I think, 2 or 3 years, there's a lot of research being done. And actually, it'd be good to talk to Eugene Harris, is working on that in our Department of Biology. There's a significant number of people in the world who have Neanderthal DNA.
Which I think is so cool. I just love
Well,
that.
but that is now being picked up at certain areas, saying that, of course, the ones who don't have the Neanderthal DNA are the Africans. And they're going that way.
Interesting,
Exactly.
interesting. I mean,
You can
actually,
have certain thing that can be just very illuminating science.
right, and just cool. I mean, isn't it cool that we're part Neanderthal?
And
Yeah.
the thing is, they say, oh, exactly. So you see, Europeans
So now it's
have that,
racialized,
what
yeah.
Africans done, therefore.
That's what makes
we
us
start to
more
see
human.
now these,
Yeah.
a lot of these fringe groups, especially now with the internet,
Yeah.
Who sound, and there are all of these websites that you wouldn't think that they are actually racist groups. They seem
Yeah.
like legitimate groups. They're picking on these types of
Yeah.
of-
I would say actually we're moving away from DNA and now we're in brain chemistry. That's the new thing. That's what people want to mean everything, right? There's always sort of these scientific phenomena that are going to explain everything to us. And it used to be blood, then for a while it was hormones, then for a while it was genome, right, DNA, now neurochemistry, everything is like the brain, how the brain does that. And you know, it's like anytime that you want an explanatory system that tells you everything about everyone, it's really just because you're asking the wrong questions, right? Because nothing tells you everything about everyone. Nothing does. There is no universal explanatory system that can explain us. But that's, you know, then you have to acknowledge that people are complex and different and difficult to understand, and we're shaped internally and environmentally. And, you know, that's much more complicated than our brains make us do things.
Well, I think actually to conclude, I think
Yes,
this
sorry.
talk is such a nice example of the fact that, you know, combining disciplines,
Yeah.
combining different perspectives to understand our history, to understand ourselves, to understand society is so important. You know, there is no one explanatory system, and
No,
there's
there's
one,
not.
unfortunately, explanatory discipline either. So I
Yes.
appreciate your interdisciplinary perspective.
Well,
Thank you very
and
much.
thank you everyone for
Thank you everyone
coming.
for coming.
I really appreciate it. There we go. I hope it wasn't too abstruse.
No, I have lots of questions,
Oh, okay.
but.
Let's turn this thing off. There we go.
One really last quick.
Yes, of course.
When you were talking about that guy DeWitt, I don't know.
Oh, DeWitt, yeah, John DeWitt. Ugh. Terrible
he
person.
said- I was kind of confused. I don't know if you can elaborate on
Sure.
Oriental thought patterns.
What that is, well, look, this is the thing. This is what happens when you put racists in charge, okay? To me, this idea, Oriental thought patterns, is so interesting, right? Because he's saying Japanese Americans who are raised in the US are free of Oriental thought patterns, which in the 1940s about Japan is connected to fascism, right? Is connected to unthinking obedience to authority. So whereas the ideal American is both exceptional and like everyone else, right? The Japanese are faceless and anonymous, right? And you can't tell them you can't tell them apart. And at the same time, not like the way people should be, right? So, but at the same time, he's saying, so he's really talking, even though he says so-called Japanese culture, right? He's acknowledging there is some kind of cultural component to the way people think. But at the same time, he's saying ultimately, blood trumps that, right? That even though these, Nisei they're eating lemon meringue pie and playing baseball, right? They cannot be 100% loyal to the United States. So, I mean, also there's this idea, like that a culture is unitary, so that all Japanese think the same. All Asians, they're like the Oriental thought patterns, right? All Asians think the same. And so that's really what he's talking about.
Okay, so he was a very confused man.
No, he wasn't confused at all. He wasn't confused at all. But he was dealing with, he wasn't confused, and he was like, well, Japanese Americans are disloyal. They cannot do anything about that. They cannot be real citizens. They cannot be legitimate Americans, and that's that. He was very clear. Just he had this very kind of bizarre set of explanatory, kind of apparatus to do that with. But no, I mean, it's interesting because when I actually was having this conversation with we were talking about blackface minstrelsy, actually, which is, I was teaching this early American drama course, and she's like, oh, these people are so ignorant. And I'm like, no, they're not ignorant. They hang out, right? They're hanging out with black people. They're not ignorant. They're racist. And that's not the same thing, right? That ignorance and racism are not the same thing. And I think that's something, what I'm trying to do here is sort of separate out those. Yeah.
What's the difference between ignorance and racism?
I think that, for example, you can have friends of a different race and still have racist ideas, right? You can still, because they're very, very powerful. So you can know African American and Latino people, you can hang out with them, but that doesn't mean that you're not still bombarded by white supremacy. I mean, this idea that like, well, if you just get to know someone, your negative ideas about them will just fall away. I mean, I think Nazi Germany is an excellent example, right? These are people who lived side by side.
So in other words, if you know people who are ethnic or minority, you still get to keep your stereotypes.
Well, people do, I mean, there's, you have to say, I am committed to anti-racism, not just I have black friends.
Statement like all Asians are good at math.
Right, it's a race, right. Right, but even if you know Asians who aren't good at math, you'd be like, oh, well, you're not like all the others,
Exactly.
right? Anyway, thank you, everyone. Thank you for coming.